He thought he had traveled to the fictional Victorian era and was thinking about how to live a wonderful second, but he never expected to meet Charlotte Holmes through a friend's introduction. Mississippi. Well, it turns out to be the world of mystery novels. Which is also a bit interesting. However, as the investigation of the case deepened, he was surprised to find that behind those incredible cases, there was truly a supernatural power hidden. Uncovering the numerous secrets beneath the surface of the world, including Noon and Mansu, the 9 principles, the invisible technique, and the strange hunger and thirst that engulfed him. He had just walked into his own chain bookstore when Charlotte, the renowned detective and Duchess of London, chased after him. "Watson, I need your help. We once worked together to solve so many bizarre cases, destroy so many evil associations, and break free the fog from the control of the departing officials. But recently I realized that it's not over yet. There is still an extremely secretive secret cult lurking in London, with a power as wide as a big net that tightly envelopes the city of fog. Compared to the dangerous characters we once defeated, they are just small and insignificant. Even terrifying ones like Moriarty are difficult to match. Watson. Let's fight hand in hand once again and bring peace to London." Miss Holmes, who had not fought alongside him for a long time, left satisfied when he comforted and promised to help her defeat this evil underground organization. At this moment, a graceful lady walked out of the door behind the bookstore, bowing and fervently saying, "Master, all the branch ceremonies are ready, waiting for you to ascend and achieve great success." Keywords of the novel. I created Esoteric Buddhism in London without a pop-up window. I downloaded the complete text of Esoteric Buddhism in London, and I read the latest chapters of Esoteric Buddhism in London. Chapter 1. The Eagle of Berkshire Brigade. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 1. The Eagle of Berkshire Brigade. Autumn 1880, London. The sky is dark and deep, and a dense haze envelopes the entire city like a sky wall. The outside of St. Pancras Station was filled with carriages, and the long-haired animals were gasping for breath from the cold. They couldn't help but move their bodies in an attempt to dispel the cold. Horseshoe trampled on the frozen soil, splashing gray and muddy snow. Woo-woo-woo-woo, the long snake made of steel emits rhythmic roars, echoing for hundreds of meters. The rough locomotive slowly drove in, and the rhythm of the crankshaft and connecting rod between the wheels gradually slowed down to a stop. A large amount of steam sprayed out from the roof, quickly rendering the platform white. This is not an ordinary return train. It has just returned from Portsmouth Dock, where the Orance, which has just docked on the coast, is a troop transport ship returning from the European continent. The ship is filled with soldiers who have retired due to disability or contract expiration. The platform of the station was already filled with family members welcoming the returning employees, including well-dressed wealthy and poorly dressed poor, but they all waited with the same expectations. The carriage doors opened one by one with a click, and the flag-waving conductor jumped out first, followed by the soldiers carrying large and small bags. They were dressed in uniform lobster-like sergeants, most of whom were injured with missing arms and legs, but their tired faces were filled with endless joy of returning home. The gentlewoman smiled and took her child's arm, while the nearby servant rushed up to pick up the young master's luggage. It was a wealthy family. Poor families also put on washed and bulky winter clothes, with tears of joy and affection on their wrinkled faces, and held on to their son's remaining arm while laughing and crying. The joyful atmosphere of family reunion overshadowed the severe cold, and the bleak winter station seemed to add some bright colors. All the retired soldiers were immersed in the joy of returning home, except for one. He carried his luggage alone and was not welcomed, dressed in a dark gray windbreaker. His figure was only a bit lonely, appearing out of place with the festivities around him. He is 6 feet tall, with sharp black short hair, sharp features, but a haggard and emaciated face. His dark pupils are filled with confusion about the future. Although he appeared to have all 4 limbs intact, he leaned on a cane to support his body. He stumbled and limped as he walked, and his right leg seemed powerless. Watson looked up at the sky outside the platform, as he knew in another world, with a thick haze covering the sky and the air filled with misty moisture and fine particles. If it were him before, he might have choked and coughed continuously. But now his body has become accustomed to it, and even after experiencing the near-death Battle of Maiwand, he feels that the environment here is much better than the smoke choking in the trenches. Just like countless predecessors of travelers, Watson, who was originally an abandoned baby without a father or mother, was abandoned at the entrance of George Muller's church orphanage, with a basket containing a note with his name written on it. After reaching adulthood, old Watson worked as a laborer on the streets and eventually signed a 3-year voluntary military service contract with passion and a desire for money, joining the British Army. Unfortunately, when he first stepped onto the front line, he was intimidated by the roar of artillery and the bloody battlefield. His whole body trembled, his mind was in turmoil, and he lost his soul. In a daze, his legs softened and he fell to the ground. When he got up again, the fear in his eyes had disappeared and turned to astonishment and confusion. At that time, the owner of this body had been replaced by an Easterner from the 21st century. New Watson had a service experience in another timeline in the future that could not be disclosed due to confidentiality treaties. He had a higher tolerance for the brutality of war and, with advanced military literacy and an indispensable bit of luck, survived this war peacefully. Until the later stages of the war, when Watson led his team to clear the battlefield, he was ambushed by enemy troops in advance. This time, the Fulstein people's already skilled Jezer rifled gun was exceptionally precise, hitting his knees and shoulders like divine assistance. He immediately rolled off the horse's back. If it weren't for the timely rescue of duty soldier Murray, who grabbed him on horseback and safely transported him back to the rear base, Watson might have fallen into the hands of the cruel Gaji soldiers and become a trophy for the exhibition to show off. The 2 bullets shattered his scapula and scraped through the subclavian artery, the second one shattered his left tibia. The pain left Watson in a state of emaciation, his once vigorous vitality dissipating along the wound, as if an invisible hungry ghost had taken away his essence. He became increasingly weak, and his body gradually became haggard and emaciated. Watson was forced to transfer to the hospital behind Peshawar for recuperation. The wound on his shoulder had already healed, but due to the backward medical conditions at the time, his right foot ultimately left a sequela. When he stepped on the ground, it felt like he was stepping on a cloud of nothingness, making it difficult for him to work hard and even complete daily training. The doctor is unable to provide an accurate diagnosis and treatment plan, and can only diagnose it as a difficult and complicated disease, urging him to rest and recuperate well. Watson had been recuperating for over a month but did not show any improvement. As his service contract expired, he simply retired and left the Berkshire Brigade. He, who had regained his freedom, did not choose to go to the distant Eastern Hemisphere, where an unprecedented change was brewing. He was now a white-skinned eggman with a yellow heart, and due to differences in his race, he believed he did not have the courage to stand firm in his homeland. He turned around and embarked on the ship back to the island. "Hey, John, where do you live? Why don't you go back with my family's carriage?" Suddenly, someone patted Watson's shoulder. He turned around and saw that it was little Stanford, a military doctor with a bachelor's degree in medicine from the University of London. Although they had never been in the same trench, they had met in the rear camp before, and could barely be called half a comrade in arms. On the way back, they were also quite friendly friends. Watson nodded slightly and said, "Thank you, but I'm not sure where to stay yet. Maybe I'll just find an apartment to take a break for a while. Then I recommend you go to Strand Street, which is adjacent to the riverbank, with convenient transportation and reasonable prices. It looks like a good suggestion. Let's go, let my coachman take you over." Little Stanford's enthusiasm made it difficult for Watson to refuse. He waved his hand and refused the hand of the other servant who reached out to pick up the luggage, insisting on carrying it himself. In addition to the sturdy suitcase maid, little Stanford was welcomed by his mother and sister, who were all of the standard Caucasian race. Their hair was slightly curled, their face was narrow and long, and their nose bridge was high, but their facial features were all handsome. The carriage of little Stanford's family is indeed spacious, and it doesn't feel crowded for 4 people to sit in. The cushion is even softer and more comfortable than the train seats. The carriage slowly passed through the streets of London, which was the first time Watson had witnessed this industrial city with his own eyes since his birth. Although he inherited his original memories, it ultimately came from the senses of others, like a modeled film, full of unreality. He was curious like Lu Lau Lau, who had just entered the Grandview Garden, and turned his head to look out of the car. The buildings on both sides of the street were just like this chaotic era, with a mix of various styles. The Industrial Revolution led to the widespread use of modern products such as glass and steel frames, resulting in the emergence of large dot-span and magnificent buildings. The walls were artistic patterns made of various colored bricks and stones, and the domes were round or square. Various retro-style designs were integrated with new industrial materials, presenting a diverse city. But the pedestrians seen along the way are not as vibrant as this thriving city, mostly with furrowed brows and faces depicting the hardships of life. Along the way, little Stanford kept telling about his thrilling experiences in the military, which caused his mother and sister to scream and occasionally even pulled Watson to join the chat. At first, Watson had some spare time to reply, but gradually grew tired. He was not the kind of person who could speak eloquently and liked to share himself with outsiders. But little Stanford seems to enjoy bringing him along in his conversations, perhaps to reinforce the authenticity of the story with his affirmation. Watson can only act as a ruthless response machine, nodding repeatedly and saying yes. You're right, that time was really thrilling. When the carriage arrived at the riverbank, little Stanford's story was not yet finished, but he didn't forget about his comrade beside him. He knocked on the inner wall of the carriage and shouted to the servant driving the carriage, "Claude, stop at a good affordable hotel nearby. My friend hasn't found a place to stay yet." "Yes, young master." After giving orders to his subordinates, little Stanford turned to Watson and asked, "John, do you want to come out for a drink tomorrow?" "No problem, if you give me a place, I will definitely be on time for the appointment." Watson also had his own thoughts. Although he received a considerable income after retiring, enough to live comfortably for a period of time, he was deeply influenced by the Eastern concept of hard work and was not willing to sit idle. He was planning to find a suitable job in London. He used to come from an orphan background, with shallow network experience, and most likely couldn't find any suitable job. However, little Stanford, who clearly came from a wealthy background, could clearly provide him with a lot of help in his search for a job. "That's settled. Tomorrow, I'll have Claude come to pick you up, and we'll go together." As they spoke, the carriage slowly stopped and Claude's voice came from ahead, "Young master, what do you think of this place?" Stanford and Watson looked out of the car at the same time. They were parked next to a small hotel, which seemed to be newly built not long ago. The exterior looked quite new, and looking inside through the fashionable glass door, the interior decoration was not luxurious, but it was perfectly simple and clean. The key was that the price on the sign placed in front of the door was quite reasonable. Watson said first, "I think it's pretty good, let's just leave it here." Although little Stanford felt that the environment was a bit rudimentary, he couldn't say much at this point. "Then tomorrow at 11 o'clock, I'll have Claude come to pick you up together," he said. "Well, Mrs. Stanford and Miss Stanford, goodbye." After Watson finished speaking, he walked straight out of the car, declined Victor's help, took off his luggage from the car, stood in place, and waved goodbye to the gradually fading carriage. After leaving, Elizabeth Stanford, who had maintained a dignified smile due to her upbringing, immediately collapsed and looked out the window with a disdainful expression. The garbage hotel without even a doorman, the dirty and noisy environment, and the disabled soldier with a stinky face all the way. Thinking of this, Elizabeth Stanford couldn't help but show a hint of anger on her face. She preached to her younger brother and said, "Leland, don't socialize with these poor people in the future." An orphan from the East End, powerless, will never be able to get rid of his lowly status for the rest of his life, and is not worthy of being friends with us." Faced with his sister's vulgar remarks, little Stanford shook his head and said, "Elizabeth, you won't understand, Watson." He paused and looked at Watson's limping figure, as if recalling, with a hint of longing and admiration on his face. Watson was a buried war hero, known locally as the Eagle of Berkshire Brigade, in Fulstein. He went deep into enemy territory to rescue dozens of captured colleagues, and defended his position alone to repel multiple attacks, killing and injuring hundreds of enemies. If it weren't for Watson's disobedience to military orders and beating his superiors, his achievements would be enough to win an Queen's Cross. This book's worldview is based on a niche game. The Esoteric Simulator. Chase taboo treasures and summon strange gods, and follow the creed to create esoteric teachings. End of this chapter. 2. Chapter 2 Interesting Jobs. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 2 Interesting Jobs. The hotel owner is a middle-aged couple with charming faces. The husband leans against the bar and reads the latest Strand Street magazine, while the wife sits to rest and taste coffee. They seem to recognize Watson as a hero injured in battle, with a very enthusiastic service attitude and a discounted offer. Watson once again declined the boss's offer to help carry his luggage and insisted on going upstairs on his own. This hotel was renovated from a private residence, so the layout of guest rooms varies in size. Perhaps due to the off-season, there are not many guests at this time. He chose a guest room located on the top floor. The room was not big, but it was quite clean. The washed white bedding always had a strong smell of plum rain that had not been exposed to the sun for a long time. This is also a major drawback of living in London. Watson unloaded his luggage, placed his cane by the bed, and tried to move his right leg, but it still showed no signs of improvement. Not to mention running recklessly, even walking could only be hesitant. This inevitably made him feel a bit pessimistic. Originally, apart from more cutting-edge ideas, the only thing I could rely on was my military combat experience, and I could have used it to find a hard work. Nowadays, with half a leg broken, it may be difficult to even apply for a job as a bar janitor. Watson sighed, feeling that his future seemed somewhat bleak. If he really couldn't find a suitable job, it seemed like he would have to regain his old job. However, is there any job in London that can use skills such as enemy rear infiltration, assault beheading, subversion of riots, and so on? After several days of fatigue in the boat and carriage, he was also a bit tired now. He lay in bed, listening to the occasional sound of carriages outside the window, and fell asleep. The next morning, Watson was downstairs sipping tea and chatting with the landlord and his wife. He was drinking black tea from Sam, which was also mixed with fresh milk. The taste was strong and astringent, with a hint of milk-sweet aroma. There was a heavy rain in London this morning, and the land on the road was a bit muddy. Little Stanford's carriage drove to the hotel as scheduled, splashing mud flowers. Watson said goodbye to the landlord and his wife, picked up his cane, and walked into the carriage. They took a car to Holborn Restaurant, and little Stanford had already reserved a quiet spot. Little Stanford skillfully ordered the dishes, shook the awakened wine in his glass, and looked at the buried war hero in front of him. "Watson, what are your plans for returning to London? This is like hitting a pillow while dozing off." In this backward era with no job market, Watson is worried about where to find a job. "I'm thinking of finding a suitable job. Do you have anything to recommend?" Little Stanford chuckled and drank all the wine in his glass. He patted his chest confidently and said, "You're really asking the right person. Our Stanford family still has some connections in London. You can speak up boldly about your requirements, and I'll definitely arrange it for you." Watson nodded, knowing that the other party was not exaggerating. Although the Stanford family were not royal relatives, they were considered a long-standing aristocrat in London. But in fact, he himself has no specific goals. "Actually, I haven't figured it out yet. I'm basically looking for a job that's not so boring, that allows me to frequently encounter new things, is exciting but not dangerous, and has a certain level of challenge for both mental and physical abilities. This answer was somewhat unexpected for little Stanford. He had thought Watson would want to find a job related to his military experience, at least so as not to waste the opponent's skills on the battlefield. The prepared arguments cannot be smoothly thrown out now. Fun, thrilling, challenging. Little Stanford lowered his head and murmured these few needs, lost in deep thought. After a moment, he suddenly punched and excitedly shouted, "Got it! I've thought of a job that meets your requirements." "Oh. What kind of job is it?" Watson was also a bit surprised. After all, he didn't have a clear idea in his heart after saying all those demands. "How about a private detective?" Little Stanford explained, "London is currently the most advanced city in the world, attracting countless immigrants. The dense population is a breeding ground for crime, and the peacekeeping police force of the authorities is seriously insufficient, with numerous difficult cases emerging. Especially among the nobility, some cases are not suitable for public disclosure, and they mostly choose trusted private detectives to investigate. If you open a private detective agency, Watson, you don't need to squat in the office all day and work repeatedly. You can also frequently witness the bizarre things among nobles, and the process of solving cases is also extremely challenging. Isn't it just fulfilling Watson's requirements? Private detective. When Watson first heard about this profession, the first thing that came to his mind were Reaper Elementary School and Scroller. He had intended to shake his head and deny it, but upon closer reflection, he found that little Stanford seemed to have made quite a point. Apart from the tedious process of monitoring, this private detective also tracked and arrested suspects, investigated and inferred cases. All of which seemed to meet his previous requirements. And currently it is also the time for the rise of detective culture. The most important point is that Watson was once a genuine fan of detective fiction, and he did have a great interest in the detective industry. And if you become a detective, you must encounter many cruel and damned criminals. So, it's reasonable and legal for me to use them to vent my inner desire for murder. Good idea. Watson gave a heartfelt admiration. However, it should be difficult for this industry to trust strangers like me, especially since I have no experience working within the police station. Opening a detective agency directly may not attract customers. Little Stanford waved his hand and said, "It's not a big deal. I happen to know a detective who is recruiting assistants and can recommend a few for you. Let's start by accumulating experience and fame as assistants, and it's not too late to start our own business when we have strong wings." Just. Little Stanford hesitated in his tone and said, "I have to agree with you beforehand. That detective is not easy to get along with, you need to be mentally prepared." "Why? Is it possible that this person's character is problematic?" "Oh, that's not what I mean. As far as I know, she can barely be described as having a good character, but she has a somewhat peculiar personality and is particularly obsessed with certain scientific fields, often coming up with strange ideas." Is this detective a lady?" Watson was indeed somewhat surprised. Although the women's liberation movement has emerged, it has not yet reached the era where women can hold up half of the sky. Women still face discrimination in the workplace and are not very popular in most industries. Little Stanford nodded heavily and said, "Yes, although she is a young lady, she is indeed very talented in the field of detective. Even though she has a strange personality, her detective agency has never lacked business, and the customers she interacts with are almost breaking through the threshold." "You have been saying that this female detective has a strange and difficult personality to get along with, but what are the specific manifestations? Can you give me an example so that I can be mentally prepared?" "Some things can only be understood without words," little Stanford chuckled. "Actually, her temper is also normal. It's just that she's too passionate about science, which makes it seem strange in the eyes of others. I remember one time at a banquet, she was tired of facing a persistent pursuer and even took out a small glass bottle from her arms containing toxic alkaloids. As long as the passionate pursuer was willing to help taste it, she agreed to go on a date with her. Little Stanford paused for a moment, seemingly wanting to observe Watson's reaction upon hearing this. However, this disabled war hero is indeed mentally resolute, with a calm expression on his face, still showing a serious listening expression. He had no choice but to take a sip of wine and pretend to moisten his throat, continuing, "Of course, this is not purely malicious, but also includes the purpose of scientific research. While driving away pursuers, she can also try to verify the effects of this alkaloid on the human body. Of course, I believe if there were other professionals on site to help record it, she would definitely be able to swallow the alkaloid without hesitation." Watson, on the other hand, was not surprised. He just sounded like a fanatical scientist, waving his hand. "It's okay, at least she would remind others that it's a poison," he said. "Hey. She is more than that. Another time I saw with my own eyes that she dragged the dead body out of the autopsy room in front of others and beat it with a stick, just to verify the condition of the scars left on the body. What a freak." Little Stanford was somewhat resentful. It seemed that witnessing that scene back then really left a shadow in his mind. Watson also frowned upon hearing this, not feeling disgusted with the strange behavior of the female detective, but suddenly realizing why this experience sounded so familiar to him, as if it highly coincided with a well-known novel character in later generations. And she also. Wait a moment, Watson couldn't help but interrupt Little Stanford's words, wanting to verify his unrealistic conjecture. "The female detective you're talking about has a distinguished name. Charlotte Holmes. Master of this work. John H. Watson background. Retired officer initial attributes. Health, *2, pain, *1, passion, *1, passion, destruction, *1 rationality, *2, funds, *28, end of this chapter." Chapter 3. Sherlock Holmes with white hair. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 3. Sherlock Holmes with white hair, sleeping slot. Women's version of Sherlock Holmes. Upon hearing such shocking news, Watson couldn't help but utter a sentence of national essence. Fortunately, he could almost control his emotions without showing any signs of joy or anger. He didn't let his surprised expression completely appear on his face, but only frowned slightly. Little Stanford observed the subtle changes in his comrade's expression and said, "Watson, do you also know Charlotte?" "I have heard of it a bit." Watson quickly restrained his surprised expression and pretended to smile lightly. In fact, he had already stirred up countless waves in his heart. If this world was truly the Sherlock Holmes detective series written by Conan Doyle, shouldn't Watson be translated as Watson? Did I travel through time and become a character in a novel? It's interesting, but it's really interesting. When Watson found out that he was highly likely to have traveled through time and become a fictional character in the novel, he felt a little secretly happy and followed Holmes. It seemed quite interesting, and it seemed that the days ahead would not be boring anymore. However, Watson vaguely remembers that Watson in the original work was a military doctor who graduated from a prestigious school. How did he become an orphan soldier in his own hands? Is this the legendary deviation of the traveler? During the conversation, they turned into a narrow alley, passed through a small side door, and entered a small side building inside Bart's hospital. This place is somewhat chilly for some reason, with a unique coolness of a morgue. Little Stanford seemed to know this place like the back of his hand. They walked up the dim white stone steps, passing through a long corridor with pink walls and dark brown doors on both sides. We have almost reached the end of the corridor, passing through the low arched corridor, all the way to the room with the laboratory sign. The laboratory is quite spacious, with countless glass bottles scattered around, containing liquids and particles of different colors. Several short and wide long tables are arranged in a vertical and horizontal manner, on which experimental equipment such as gas burners, test tubes, and distillation flasks are placed. There was only one person working in the room, and she sat at a table in the corner, working at her desk. Watson could only see a slender figure wearing a white coat and a high-tied light golden ponytail. She seemed to be studying the items on the table with great concentration, completely unaware that anyone had arrived. Stanford and Watson exchanged a glance and whispered, "You see, I'm not talking nonsense. She's quite focused on scientific research." Watson nodded in agreement, and the two of them remained silent without interfering with the female detective's research. In an instant, the light gray figure suddenly jumped up and cheered, "I found it. I found it." Her voice is slightly hoarse and deep, quite magnetic. Little Stanford seemed to be infected with this joy and asked with a light smile, "Charlotte, what did you find so happy about?" The female detective turned around and exclaimed excitedly, "I have discovered a reagent that can only precipitate with hemoglobin, nothing else works." At this moment, Watson was able to catch a glimpse of the true face of this later famous detective. Her appearance gives the first impression that she is extremely eye-catching. He is nearly 6 feet tall, with an extremely tall and slender physique. He has long, light gold-like white hair tied into a high ponytail, appearing exceptionally sharp and capable. Female Sherlock Holmes seems to have ancestry from other countries, with snow-white skin as delicate and flawless as top quality porcelain. Her facial features are sharp and angular, with a hint of neutral beauty, making her appear even more heroic. The thick sword eyebrows were slightly raised, and a pair of charming Danfang eyes had a slight hint of light lower white, highlighting the depth of gray pupils. The nose bridge was high and elegant. When she is laughing, her thin lips will slightly curl up, especially cold, and her full chin with a slight beauty groove also makes her appearance more recognizable. Such an eye-catching appearance doesn't seem very suitable for work that requires covert work like detective, Watson thought. "Charlotte, this is Watson," little Stanford introduced. "Watson, this is Charlotte." Charlotte kindly extended her hand and said, "Hello, Mr. Watson." "Hello, Miss Charlotte." Watson held her hand tightly. Her palms were not soft, and there were faint calluses on the tendons under the thumb, the belly of the four fingers, and the mouth of the tiger. It seemed that she had a habit of practicing fencing or firearms. He also noticed that the other party was wearing a neutral-style outfit under a white coat, with a clean white shirt paired with a brown vest, tight horse pants outlining round thighs, and high leather riding boots rubbing against each other. Charlotte asked, "Have you just returned from Fulstein?" Upon hearing this classic dialogue, Watson smiled silently, seeming to be showcasing his deductive reasoning skills. He retorted, "That's right, and you're from a manor outside the city, right?" Charlotte was taken aback by the words and swallowed the reasoning she had originally planned to throw back into her stomach. She looked down at her leather boots, recalling the muddy streets she had seen when she entered the city this morning. It was obvious that there had been a heavy rain in the city. Sherlock Holmes lived on a manor outside the city, and the ground was stronger without being wetted by rainwater, so he wouldn't get mud stains when stepping on it. "Is it inferred from the soles of my boots?" Charlotte looked up at Watson's dark eyes, as if she could see something familiar inside, which was a rational trait she could see in the mirror every morning while washing. The two looked at each other and suddenly burst into laughter, their palms clenched even tighter. "Ha ha ha, Leland, your friend is very interesting. Ha ha ha, I have long heard that there is a clever Miss Charlotte in the city of London. When we officially met today, we realized that she truly lives up to her name." Watson and Charlotte's polite interactions made them seem like they had known each other for many years, making even their true friend, little Stanford, feel like they were a bit unnecessary. He quickly interjected to show his presence, pointing to the test tube in the female detective's hand and asking, "Charlotte, you just said that this reagent can only precipitate with blood protein. What's the use of it?" Charlotte gave him a displeased look and said, "You haven't even realized the importance of such a groundbreaking discovery, Leland. Fortunately, you're still a doctoral student in medical school. Watson spoke up and said, is it used for identifying dried blood stains? The current popular blood stain identification methods are still the guaiacol identification method and microscopic observation of blood cells. These two methods are difficult to operate and not accurate enough, and cannot detect dried blood stains. Miss Charlotte's discovery, which is easy to operate and also applicable to the identification of dry and wet blood stains, can be said to solve the long-standing problem of blood identification in the industry. Watson vaguely remembered this passage and added some of his own knowledge, explaining it to little Stanford. Charlotte's beautiful eyes flickered, and she added a few more points to Watson's evaluation in her heart. That's right. With my new testing method, blood stain identification will no longer be difficult. Watson clapped lightly and said, congratulations, congratulations. This Sherlock Holmes identification method will surely spread all over the world in the future. Hundreds or even thousands of criminals will find it difficult to escape legal pursuit. Charlotte caressed her chest with one hand, bowed slightly in gratitude, and smiled humbly, saying, you're right. If we had discovered this method early on, there would have been more than 20 cases like the Von Bischoff murder, Mason, Mahler, Lefevre, Samson, and so on. The perpetrators of these cases should have been hanged long ago. You are really a walking crime dictionary, little Stanford also applauded with a smile. With your profound knowledge of crime, you can almost start a newspaper about crime. Why not name it Police Old Record? Watson also politely complimented newspapers about criminal cases. Sound very interesting. Stop telling these jokes. Charlotte waved her hand and said, Leland, what's the point of coming to see me this time? Don't invite me to any noble ball again, you know I've never liked to get involved in these boring things. You're really wrong about me this time, Stanford said seriously, pointing to his comrade beside him with a look of great injustice. I'm here mainly for Watson. He just retired from the military and is planning to find a suitable job. Last night at the banquet, I heard others say that you're planning to expand the detective agency and definitely need to increase manpower. How do you think of Watson? Don't joke, with Mr. Watson's keen insight, he is fully capable of handling the affairs of a detective agency on his own, and there is no need to come to my agency as a lowly assistant. No, 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 no. Watson repeatedly denied, I am still an inexperienced newcomer in the detective world, and it is my honor to study under Miss Charlotte. I don't need a generous salary, as long as I have enough food and clothing. Besides. Watson paused and said meaningfully. Besides, I have a premonition that following Miss Charlotte to solve the case would definitely be an extremely interesting thing. Charlotte pondered for a moment, pondering whether this plan was feasible. After a while, she spoke up and said, okay, since you have Leland as your guarantor, I think Mr. Watson does meet my requirements. It's my luck to have such an assistant. That's for sure. Watson is the eagle of our Berkshire Brigade. With him joining your detective agency, you can rest assured. Little Stanford finally fulfilled his promise to Watson and laughed heartily. He didn't want to lose face in front of this idol. Watson was also very happy, and serving as Holmes' assistant was an extremely interesting job. So let's sign the contract now. I have something else to do this afternoon. Why don't Mr. Watson come over to my detective agency tomorrow morning so that I can have the lawyer prepare the contract today? No problem, where is your detective office? Watson was asking knowingly. Holmes's address is well known in later generations. Would he not have known it, but he still wanted to hear the master say that address himself. 221B, Baker Street. End of this chapter. Chapter 4. Chamber Murder Cases. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 4 Chamber Murder Cases. It has been proven that detective work is not as interesting as Watson imagined. It has been a week since he became Miss Holmes's assistant, and after signing the labor contract, Charlotte saw that he had no fixed residence, so she allocated the vacant room upstairs to him as a bedroom. Watson also brought his luggage over and took on the security work at Sherlock Holmes. 221B, Baker Street was originally a 3-story apartment building, purchased by Miss Charlotte's father, the Duke of Holmes, and transformed into a professional detective agency. The spacious and ventilated lobby became an office for receiving customers. Unlike the original work, Charlotte does not live here. She is actually a wealthy aristocratic daughter who spends most of her time busy with her own affairs, such as chemical experiments, autopsy, swordsmanship practice, equestrian training, firearms shooting. Her daily life can be said to be rich. So this vast detective agency was fully entrusted to Watson for management, which seemed to have a lot of power. In fact, it was responsible for doing miscellaneous tasks such as cleaning, receiving customers and recording their needs, organizing and summarizing cases in the newspaper. The work in business can be said to be quite tedious. Although there are also some jobs that come to your doorstep voluntarily, most of which are personally visited by aristocratic gentlemen/ladies dressed in gorgeous clothes, and trusting your detective agency to help search for missing pets, investigate lost property, and find evidence of the mistress/master's affair. It's all trivial matters, and although the nobles promised quite generous rewards, it's more like some kind of free gift than work. These distinguished guests were mostly personally received by Sherlock Holmes. While Watson was preparing tea, he did not see any signs of anxiety from the customers. Instead, he looked indifferent as a leisurely tourist, pointing at the decoration of the detective office. Charlotte appeared friendly to these guests on the surface, but as soon as they left, she immediately restrained her smile and instructed Watson. Jobs like this that clearly pay more than the market do not need to be investigated, just receive them well and pretend to take careful notes. There are also some ordinary visitors, street vendors involved in commercial disputes, railway workers who make mistakes in their work, old gentlemen with disharmonious families, fashionable girls lost in the future. They were all introduced by other private detectives, and they really encountered some trouble. They urgently needed guidance from fair and intelligent people. Holmes would first listen to their account of the situation, then analyze the problem and provide appropriate advice, in order to charge a slight consulting fee. Watson usually listens in and writes record files, but he also has a deeper understanding of the wisdom of this female version of Sherlock Holmes. Compared to the detective Sherlock in the original work, Miss Charlotte clearly has a wider range of knowledge, perhaps because she comes from a wealthy background and does not need to be distracted by money. Instead, she can allocate more energy to learn various aspects of knowledge. Perhaps due to gender differences, influenced by differences in body hormone secretion and aristocratic etiquette and upbringing, the temperament and habits of this Miss Holmes also differ from those of the original Sherlock Holmes. His temper is not so peculiar, but rather appears milder, and he does not use stimulants to boost his spirits during boring intervals without investigating cases. Excluding the natural physical differences between men and women, Miss Charlotte may not be as strong as Detective Sherlock in terms of force, but in terms of her wealth of knowledge, the Sherlock Holmes Watson knew may have already won. At least she would admit that the earth revolves around the sun. Since joining Sherlock Holmes as a detective, Watson has hardly ever stepped out of the door except during break time, and has been engaged in paperwork. Over time, he couldn't help but feel a bit bored. However, Watson is quite patient, and he also knows that in reality, Sherlock Holmes cannot be like a Grim Reaper elementary school student. There are various types of homicides happening around him every day. He was also happy to be idle. Every day he sat in the hall flipping through old books bought from street vendors, enriching his knowledge and gradually calming down his restless heart. Occasionally, at the invitation of little Stanford, we gather to drink 2 pots of small wine and live a particularly leisurely life. From a heart-to-heart perspective, little Stanford is indeed a good friend. Although he comes from a wealthy family, he does not show any airs in dealing with people and things. He often indulges in delicious food and wine, and introduces him to a good job. He also introduces the interpersonal network and interesting stories of various social classes in London at the dinner table, which really helps Watson integrate into London. The leisurely daily routine lasted for almost a month, but Watson's leg and foot problems still did not improve. However, the calm life began to ripple. Everything starts with that handwritten letter. On this day, Holmes had a rare leisure. She had just finished her experimental work upstairs and sat with Watson in the reception hall, sipping black tea. After a month of getting along, the relationship between the two has become much more familiar, enough to start a joke. During the conversation, Charlotte suddenly walked to the window and pointed out, saying, "Watson, guess what identity that person is." This is a small game during their leisure time, where they judge the identity and destination of passers-by by observing their words and expressions. Watson heard the sound and walked to the window, following Charlotte's ink-stained fingers. "I saw a simple and sturdy man across the street, with a thick beard on his face." Watson had seen many people in the military in this shape. The man slowly moved his steps with his head held high, his sharp eyes fixed on the house numbers of each household, counting them from door to door. He held a large blue envelope in his right hand. Although he was not wearing a uniform, he was clearly a messenger. Watson also noticed a blue sea anchor-like tattoo on the back of the other person's hand holding the letter, resembling some kind of sailor's emblem. He only glanced at it and immediately came to the conclusion, this is a recently discharged naval officer, whose military-style beard on his face, sailor tattoos on the back of his hands, and his leadership-like demeanor, all prove this. And I boldly speculate that he is likely looking for our Sherlock Holmes detective agency. As soon as the words fell, the person outside the window suddenly realized and looked at the room, running over with a meteor-like stride. Dong dong dong, there was an urgent and heavy knocking outside the door. Charlotte applauded and praised, "Beautiful, what a wonderful deduction." Watson smiled and got up to open the door for the visitor. The visitor asked in a deep voice, "Hello, may I ask if Miss Holmes is here? I have a letter from her." The female detective walked over and said, "I am Charlotte Holmes." The person seemed to be confirming Holmes' appearance, nodded, and took out an envelope from his arms. "Hello, Miss Holmes, this is your letter. Do you need to reply on sight?" After receiving Charlotte's head-shaking denial, the person thrust the letter into Charlotte's hand. He gathered his heels together, stood at attention, raised his hand to salute, and hurriedly ran down to the next place. Charlotte sat back on the sofa, opened the letters and browsed through them, her face suddenly showing an excited expression, like a child receiving a new toy. She threw the letter over and said, "Watson, take a look at this. There's a strange case coming to your door." Watson took the letter and looked at it. "Dear Miss Charlotte Holmes, last night, a strange murder occurred at 3, Lauriston Garden Street. The location of the incident was an abandoned house that had been abandoned for a long time. Around 3 a.m., the surrounding patrol officers heard a mournful scream inside the house. Knowing that the house had been uninhabited for a long time, the patrol officers suspected something was wrong and went to investigate. The doors and windows of this abandoned house were all locked, and there was no light leakage inside. The patrol officer forcefully broke through the door lock and entered, only to find the body of a middle-aged man lying in a hall filled with books. The deceased was a well-dressed gentleman, dressed neatly and without any robbery, and had no identification documents on his body. There are no signs of fighting at the scene of the crime, and there are no scars on the body. The cause of death is unknown. Why did the deceased enter an empty house, and how did the killer commit the crime? We are puzzled and deeply feel the intricacy of this case. Please come here at 12 o'clock, we will be waiting for your visit on site. Everything at the crime scene will remain unchanged until we receive your reply. If you don't have free time to come, we will also inform you of the follow-up details. We would greatly appreciate your on-site guidance. Dear Tobias Grayson. Watson muttered to himself, the study of blood characters. End of this chapter. Chapter 5. Research on lamp characters. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 5. Research on lamp characters. It seems to be the first case in the original work. The study of the character, blood. Watson looked at the signature at the end of the letter. Tobias Grayson. He had heard of this name, and he was also a detective, but unlike wild detectives like Sherlock Holmes, he was an official detective belonging to the Scotland Yard and ate public meals. Among a group of grassroots detectives in London, he and another Lester are the only two outstanding figures, who can be called sharp and capable, but both have a problem with being conservative. They are too old-fashioned in their thinking and find it difficult to accept the new scientific methods of solving cases, so they are actually inferior to detectives. And these two people have always had a bad temper and engaged in various open and secret struggles. If they were both responsible for this case, there would be a good scene to watch. All of which are from Charlotte's original words. Watson asked, "Do you want to go there?" Charlotte pondered, "I haven't decided whether or not to go yet. Grayson always looks down on us female detectives, and only thinks of me when encountering unsolvable difficult cases. I was just thinking about whether to take advantage of his plea to me and give him a thumbs up. Moreover, even if the case is solved, this guy will definitely take credit for it on himself." Charlotte combed her disheveled hair back in her ear and murmured, "However, it's rare for me to personally go to the crime scene and undermine his authority. In the past, Grace knew in his heart that his talent was far inferior to mine, but he never dared to admit it in front of others. This time, I happened to go to the scene and mock him well in front of his subordinates. Then I'll notify Victor." Victor was the coachman of the Sherlock Holmes family, specifically Charlotte's exclusive coachman, and the spacious four-wheeled carriage belonged exclusively to her. Charlotte put on a woolen coat, and her eager excitement had already exposed her true thoughts. She looked at Watson's right leg and said, "By the way, are your legs still agile?" Watson pretended to smile lightly and danced his cane. "There's no problem, it's just that I can't run. Besides, tracking criminals is not my turn, right?" They got onto Victor's carriage and quickly arrived at the street where the crime occurred. This place is slightly far from the bustling city center, with only 4 houses on the entire street, of which 2 are vacant and sparsely populated, making it a feng shui treasure trove for committing crimes. On the other hand, number 3 Lauriston Garden Street is a typical haunted mansion just by looking at its exterior. The long neglected grass in the garden is withered and sparse, and the moldy walls are covered with dense ivy. The thick gray window glass is like a white mist, especially the small round window in the attic, which is most eye-catching, like the monocular of the giant Polymorphus. The withered old tree twisted like a desperate cry, combined with London's unique haze weather filter, gives a feeling of gloomy energy at a glance. At this moment, there is a circle of good people around the wooden fence wall at the scene, totaling more than 10. Watson estimated that residents from 3 nearby streets might have rushed here to join in the fun. There is only one burly police officer blocking the entrance of the courtyard to maintain order and prevent idle men from entering and disturbing the scene. Watson followed the tall female detective and got off the carriage. Charlotte did not go straight to the crime scene, but instead walked slowly around the outside of the yard, carefully observing the situation in the yard. He turned his gaze to the onlookers of good deeds. According to the criminal psychology that has not yet sprouted in contemporary times but has gradually improved in later generations, most criminals have the habit of returning to the crime scene, not only to avoid missing evidence, but also to constantly inquire about the progress of investigation. Moreover, for psychologically abnormal individuals, revisiting the scene is simply to see the old scenery and savor the pleasure of killing at that time. He strolled through the crowd, constantly paying attention to the expressions of people passing by, curious, fearful, worried. All kinds of faces flashed through Watson's eyes. Perhaps his expertise in micro-expression analysis was not deep enough to detect suspicious targets. "Watson, let's go inside." Miss Charlotte had already scanned her surroundings and called out to her assistant, but her expression seemed to have failed to detect any useful clues. The female detective presented Grayson's letter, and the gatekeeper released it directly. Watson slowly stepped onto the damp and muddy path in the garden, and his boots immediately got a speck of mud. He lowered his head and focused his gaze on the cluttered shoe prints in the courtyard. Identifying traces is an essential skill on the battlefield. Watson only had to scan around to know that 7 people had passed by before them. If there were no footprints completely covered by the latecomers. He even inferred the approximate height and body shape of the footprint owner based on the size and depth of the footprints. In Watson's eyes, those messy footprints appeared bright, and the light condensed into blurry figures, all constructed based on inference results. Watson silently remembered these results and followed Holmes into the courtyard. At this moment, there was a tall detective with pale yellow hair and a pale face standing at the door of the house. He held a notebook under his ribs and showed an awkward expression when he saw Sherlock Holmes, reluctantly welcoming him. "Miss Charlotte, you have finally arrived. This is really great. I have been maintaining the integrity of the crime scene for you and have not touched any details." "Oh, really, what about here?" Miss Charlotte pointed to the messy path in front of the door, as if it had been run by a group of African water buffaloes, and said with a hint of sarcasm, "Oh, I understand. Grayson, you must have thought this had nothing to do with the case, and that's why you allowed the people under your command to act so recklessly, right?" Grace wiped away a thin sweat from her forehead and explained vaguely, I've been busy inside all along, and I've left all this outside affairs to my colleague Mr. Lester Reed." "Hey! Grayson, you guy, don't throw the pot all over me. You came to this scene first." A skinny detective with a handsome and oily head rushed out from behind the door, shouting angrily at Grace. "It seems that this is another outstanding official detective in London. Lester. Are you okay with being late? Even though you live in the next block, why did you come even later than me? It's clearly a passive case handling. It seems that I must report your work attitude to my superiors." Hiccup. Lester Red let out a furious hiccup rich in single malt alcohol. "Don't talk nonsense, I worked overtime last night to handle cases, and only got up late this morning. Do you think everyone is like Grayson, doing nothing every day and leaving work on time?" As the two of them looked at each other in a fierce and cursing manner, the female detective raised a sword-like eyebrow at Watson with a look of, "You see, I'll talk." Seeing the two elite detectives intensifying and seeming to be about to take action, Charlotte quickly stepped forward and pulled them apart, jokingly cursing, "It seems that having you two big detectives here is enough, and you no longer need me, a wild little detective. So let me go." Lester Red loosened Grayson's collar and rubbed his hands to flatter, "Don't, Miss Holmes. We've done our best, but we still haven't gained anything. This is a typical case that perfectly suits your quirky appetite. That's why I specifically invited you over." Charlotte chuckled and pushed aside the 2 people blocking the door. "Let's take a look at the house first. The door panels and wooden bolts of this room have been rudely removed and thrown aside. The interior looks uninhabited for a long time, lacking human vitality, and emitting a smell of decay and mold everywhere. But the floor was cleaned very clean, which can be said to be spotless. It seems that the deceased who sneaked into the empty room was still a person who loves cleanliness, but unfortunately, his feet are now covered in muddy footprints." Watson and Holmes followed 2 detectives into the front hall and saw that the square and large room was filled with small mountain-like books, all of which were old books. The leather seal was engraved with traces of time, and he glanced roughly at them. They were all strange and widely researched literature, such as books of a suspected secret society with roses and crosses on the cover, promotional brochures of a certain temperance activist, a fragile-looking manuscript, an unattractive picture book. Watson shifted his gaze away from the seductive depiction of the body filled with desire, and turned to observe the scene. The once brightly colored wallpaper on the front hall wall has fallen off in large areas covered in mold, and a faint light has penetrated through the gaps of the wooden windows. However, it is blocked by rising dust, making the indoor environment particularly hazy and gloomy. The victim of this case lies on a swollen wooden floor, with a stiff body lying upside down in the middle of a pile of scattered books, with a beautiful kerosene lamp that has been extinguished in front of him. This kerosene lamp seems to be sculpted from intact and flawless crystals, crystal clear throughout, seemingly shining with brilliant starlight in the dimly lit room. It is truly beautiful. Watson's gaze fell on the wall of the lamp, and in a daze, he seemed to see a cold and stern glow flickering past. The light and shadow were mixed with a pale, emotionless face like a machine, silently gazing at the busy crowd inside the room, as if observing and recording, like a ghost imprisoned in it. The blazing white eyes suddenly turned towards Watson, and he met all four of them. At the moment of eye contact, a strong light burst out from the lamp. This intense light that can pierce through glass and skin, like a sharp sword piercing straight into Watson's eye. Light leaks through the cracks in the skull, like sticky liquid dripping onto the folds of the brain. A certain bone-chilling chill froze his consciousness, but his thinking became unprecedentedly clear. Watson seemed to be ascending, his noble soul detached from his weak body, and the world's radiance and colors became increasingly bright, vibrant, and colorful. "Hey buddy, give way." The police officers entering and exiting awakened Watson from his daze. He looked at the ordinary and slightly exquisite kerosene lamp in confusion, feeling as if he had forgotten something. "He comes from the glow, and we can't help but want to see it." End of this chapter. Chapter 6. Anti-Suppression Bureau. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 6. Anti-Suppression Bureau. The deceased was a Caucasian person, looking around 30 years old, with no beard or hair on his face. His skin was fair and his facial features were delicate, and he had a greasy center-cut hairstyle on his head. He was wearing a meticulously ironed white shirt and black suspenders, with no dust on the surface. Even his posture was quite natural, as if he was just sitting on the ground dozing off and naturally lying back to sleep. But his face was particularly grim, his eyes wide and bulging as he died. A strand of solidified blood seeped from the corner of his mouth, and his pale and stiff face was twisted with fear and surprise. It seemed that he had witnessed something extremely terrifying in the last moment of his life, so much so that the fear before death was deeply engraved on his body. Near the feet of the deceased, there was a dry and radiating pool of blood that appeared to have been spewed out before his death. This is not the first time Watson has had close contact with a corpse. He has seen real corpses on the battlefield in Fulstein. Compared to the scene before us, it's just a child's play. Looking at the slightly bent legs of the deceased during his lifetime, it seems that he was originally sitting cross-legged. A scene suddenly came to Watson's mind. On a pitch-black night, the victim sat cross in front of the fireplace, perhaps in contemplation or reading, when suddenly an indescribable injury or pain hit him. He couldn't help but spit out a mouthful of blood, unable to even struggle for help, leaving only a desperate scream in the end. If that's really the case, it feels a bit like a situation in a martial arts novel where the deceased is possessed by a demon. The deceased lives alone in a secret room to practice divine skills, but accidentally switches and suffers internal injuries due to the rolling of chi and blood. As there is no one to help, they can only silently wait to die. Watson gently shook his head and drove the incredible idea out of his mind. He watched the deceased's death, dressed neatly without any signs of fighting, as if he had been poisoned and died. Holmes squatted down next to the body and said, "Have you checked the body? Are you sure there are no injuries?" "Absolutely not." Two elite police officers shouted in unison. Lestrade cautiously added, "At least to the naked eye, no obvious marks of impact were found. Although some blood was found on the victim's index finger, no last words were found." Grace refused to be outdone and said, "The preliminary examination results don't seem to be poisoning, at least not conventional toxins." Holmes nodded slightly, but seemed to distrust the two elite detectives. She put on white gloves to touch the body, her slender fingers touched and pressed here and there, and even unbuttoned the victim's white shirt to check, without missing anything. Holmes was skilled and swift in his movements, completing a series of meticulous checks in a short period of time. She is more like a professional forensic expert than a detective. Finally, she confirmed and sniffed the deceased's lips closely, neither smelling the bitter almond flavor of the commonly used cyanide poison in contemporary times, nor any other unusual smell, only a faint bloody smell. In the end, a dazed and bewildered expression appeared on her face, indicating that she had achieved nothing. "Send it to the forensic examination," Miss Charlotte stood up and said, "remember to show me the detailed authentication report then." There were already stretchers and stretchers ready on site, and with Grayson's command, 2 police officers carrying stretchers ran in from outside and carried the bodies onto the stretchers. During their conversation, Watson stood silently in the corner, always walking discreetly in the blind spots of everyone's view, making people subconsciously ignore his existence, as if it was just a piece of furniture originally placed on the scene. This can also be considered as Watson's legacy on the battlefield. Always pay attention to concealing his tracks. He silently compared the body types of the 6 police officers on the scene, including the entrance guard, to the footprints-derived models he had just speculated on, except for the bottom pair of footprints that had not found their corresponding owners. Which was likely the traces of the killer. After seeing Holmes shake his head slightly and get up, Watson was also somewhat surprised. It was really not poisoning. Or is it a rare toxin that even Sherlock Holmes has not been exposed to? Seeing that even Sherlock Holmes's investigation was unsuccessful, he couldn't help but start thinking. If he were the culprit of this case, how could he create such a scene? A seemingly unscathed corpse. After excluding the toxic factor, it seems that only the factor of excessive shock leading to sudden cardiac death remains. Unless the perpetrator also masters the dark power technique from ancient Eastern legends, which can easily kill a person with just a gentle press. The scene is like a secret room. This is relatively easy, perhaps there are still hidden secret passages or doors inside the house. The small windows on the attic are very suitable, and petite people can pass through just in time. Perhaps it is a small mechanism with a delay in closing the portal, which was not noticed when entering the door and will be ignored for now. Watson even had a bold speculation that perhaps the screams heard by the patrol last night were not from the deceased, but rather a means used by the killer to confuse the line of sight. A scene came to his mind. Last night, the deceased was sitting upright on the floor of the main hall, reading books under dim lighting. Suddenly, in the shadows that could not be illuminated by light, a petite killer suddenly emerged. The killer used some unknown means to frighten the victim to death. Then the killer quickly cleaned up the traces he had appeared before, ran quickly to the attic, and emerged from the small window. At this moment, the killer witnessed a patrol officer holding a lantern not far away. Out of some kind of flashy, arrogant, or distracting thoughts, she took the initiative and, after erasing the traces in the courtyard, hid behind the house and let out a seemingly mournful cry, attracting the patrol officer to investigate. And when the patrol officer tries hard to break through the door, they will only see the victim who has fallen to the ground and cannot stand up, and in the initial subjective intention, they will mistakenly think that the other party has just died. However, there is still a doubt here. Watson rubbed his chin and thought to himself, if the first patrol officer to enter the crime scene conceals the facts at the scene or is simply an accomplice/principal offender, then my inference must be overturned. As soon as the police officers lifted the deceased, Watson, who was squatting in the corner, keenly noticed a faint dark red mark on the floor beneath the body. He pointed to the suspected pattern of evidence and shouted, "Hey, come and take a look. There seems to be something written on this floor." Lester, who carried a pipe with him, immediately squatted down, cut a match on the bottom of his boot, and leaned towards the floor. On the decaying wooden floor, where the body had once covered, there were a few blood-red letters scribbled on the floor, as if the deceased had written with their fingers dipped in blood before dying. Lantern, lamp. Everyone's gaze coincidentally turned to the exquisite kerosene lamp in front of the deceased. Lester pondered, is this a clue left by the deceased or a message from the killer? Grayson exclaimed, lamp. This case seems even more complicated. Holmes had already picked up the kerosene lamp and carefully observed it. The lamp looked very clean, transparent throughout, and there was still a lot of fuel left at the bottom. But when she looked left and right, she couldn't find any useful clues. Why do victims leave a lamp before they die? I won't mention it for now. Could you please make room for me? I need to thoroughly inspect this room. Miss Charlotte took out her tape measure and magnifying glass, which she didn't know where to hide, and began to walk slowly along the entire room. She wandered around the corners, windowsills, hallways, attic. While murmuring, sometimes stopping, sometimes squatting, sometimes lying down, completely ignoring the image of a lady, but instead appearing like a madman who had fallen for it. But in Watson's eyes, she felt more like an agile fox hunting in the forest, seemingly playful but patiently searching for prey. This was his first time following a female detective on the scene to handle a case. He was amazed by the other person's appearance as if they were alone and immersed in the world of investigation. He truly believed that he was a renowned detective who would be renowned both domestically and internationally in the future. With such a passionate work attitude, there was nothing he could not accomplish. However, to Watson's surprise, the attic floor was covered in thick dust and looked completely different from the way someone had passed by before. Is there any other secret door? He and Charlotte examined for half an hour without any useful clues, and their solemn expressions became even more profound. Two official detectives anxiously asked, "Miss Holmes, have you come up with any results?" The female detective remained calm and said, "The situation in this case is indeed more complicated than I imagined. If possible, I would like to meet the patrol officer who discovered the body last night and talk to him." Grayson and Lester looked at each other face to face and chuckled in pleasure, with a sense of relief in each other's eyes. Compared to Sherlock Holmes finding useful clues at the scene, they hope she finds nothing, which proves that the investigation in this case is not in trouble due to their lack of ability. Now it seems that this amateur colleague is not as powerful as rumored. Of course, not a problem, Grayson replied happily, glancing at the notebook in his hand. Patrol John Lance, who discovered the body, is now off work and his registered address is 3.406 Audley Apartments on Kennington Park Road. Remember to bring me the forensic report. After saying these words, the female detective turned around and left, followed closely by Watson, leaving two elite detectives in place. After they left, Lester suddenly took the initiative to discuss with his arch-rival, "Grayson, do you think? Will this case involve those things?" He stuttered and said, "Why don't we just?" Grayson nodded heavily and agreed, even Sherlock Holmes couldn't find any useful clues. "I think this case is mostly done by those things. In my opinion, we don't need to wait for any more legal results. We'd rather kill the wrong person than let it go. Just report it directly to the Anti-Suppression Bureau." End of this chapter. Chapter 7. Distorted Patrol Lance. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 7. Distorted Patrol Lance. After leaving 3, Lauriston Garden Street, Watson fully revealed his reasoning on the carriage and raised his most concerning question. Did the deceased really die from poisoning? Holmes said, "I don't rule out the possibility, but I didn't find any traces of poison in the deceased's mouth, nor did I find any hidden injection holes on the surface of the body, and there have been no obvious symptoms of poisoning. Further testing is needed to determine the true cause of death. Have you found any other clues?" Holmes shook his head gently and said, "This is exactly where I am most puzzled. After investigating the scene, apart from you, me, and the police present, there were no signs of anyone else entering. So." Holmes and Watson exchanged a glance and said in unison, "The key to this case lies in last night's patrol officer John Reams." While they were talking, Victor had already driven his carriage through the streets and alleys to come to a dirty and dim path. He pointed to the narrow gray-black alley ahead and said, "Miss Audley's apartment is right ahead. The alley is too narrow for a carriage to drive in. Could you please walk in with Mr. Watson?" "Well, Victor, you can wait for us here." "Okay, miss." Audley Apartments is a square courtyard with 4 dilapidated high-rise buildings on all sides. Clothes poles extend from the windows, and faded underwear flutters in the wind, resembling the flag of the lower class surrendering to poverty. The ground in the courtyard is paved with slate bricks, and a group of dirty children are playing and frolicking inside. They are unfortunate enough to avoid the torment of the school due to poverty, and lucky enough to avoid the destruction of the factory due to their weak physique. Their eyes still sparkle with innocence, and silver bell-like laughter echoes in the courtyard. As soon as they saw Sherlock Holmes, they all stopped and stared intently at the female detective. Such a fashionable and beautiful lady should not appear in this slum-like oddly apartment, but rather in a luxurious estate. Just like a princess in a fairy tale should stay in a castle and a tall tower. This undoubtedly makes these inferiority-complex children feel a bit restrained and at a loss. Holmes greeted them with a smile and a wave of his hand, which frightened them into taking a few steps back and shrinking into the corner of the yard. Watson stood in front of Building 3 and said, "Let's go, don't scare them. They're not used to seeing a glamorous lady like Miss Charlotte in the slums yet." Holmes followed Watson upstairs sullenly, and they arrived at gate 406, where a rusty bronze plaque was nailed with the resident's name, Reams, engraved on it. Watson was about to knock on the door when Holmes lightly twitched his nostrils and frowned before suddenly stopping him. He warned, "Something's wrong, I smell a bloody smell." Bloody smell. Watson leaned close to the crack in the door and smelled a faint salty smell emanating from inside, which was the familiar smell of blood that he couldn't help but feel. Watson couldn't help feeling a bit ashamed, and theoretically, he should have discovered it himself first. After all, he used to smell this smell all day on the battlefield and fall asleep, but I don't know if it was due to being too familiar that he subconsciously ignored it, or if that serious illness had devastated his perception and he couldn't detect it in the first place. "Take it first, just in case." Watson lowered his voice and took out his old buddy from the underarm holster inside the windbreaker, handing it to Holmes. Holmes nodded in agreement, holding the heavy pistol in both hands. This Colt M1873 revolver was not an English military standard weapon, but a personal trophy of Watson. Its .45 caliber has extremely strong power at close range and is also known as the gun that pacifies the West, on the other side of the ocean. Watson staggered back 2 steps, exerting force with one foot and slamming his shoulder into the door panel like a hammer. The fragile door lock broke instantly, and the door slammed open with a strong smell of blood. The narrow front hall was littered with food scraps scattered everywhere, half-chewed sausages, pasta stained with meat sauce, raw potatoes with bite marks, powdered bread crumbs. And a dead woman lying on the sofa. The female corpse had an unbelievable fear on her face, her eyes wide open, her mouth slightly open, and a big hole in her belly. And Watson and his team's target on this trip. Patrol John Lance, still dressed in Scotland Yard police uniform, is now lying with his back to them, gnawing on the flesh and blood-blurred female corpse, his head sinking into his belly. Even Watson, who was accustomed to the bloody scenes, felt a hint of shiver, and his hair suddenly stood on end. Miss Charlotte, upon witnessing the scene of her fellow countrymen eating each other, felt even more striking than the cold corpses in the dissecting room. Especially during her menstrual period, when she was hit by the strong smell of fishy blood, her pretty face turned pale and she vomited out with a nauseous sound. This morning, she sprayed coffee, toasted toast slices, and fried bacon all over the floor. The sound of knocking on the door just now didn't catch John Lance's attention, but the foul smell of vomit emitted by Holmes made him slowly turn around. Although Patrol John Lance's face was covered in blood and minced meat, one could still see that his facial features were upright. His eyes were still his eyes, his nose was his nose, and his ears were his ears. But his mouth. That's really not his mouth. Its jawbone cracks from the middle, with a gap extending all the way to its lower lip, and protrudes ferociously towards the separated jawbones, tearing through the skin and texture like 2 sharp curved knives. And the once flat teeth have also deformed into sharp serrations on the blade, with 2 thumbs' thick fangs curved upwards at the front, and a few fresh and hot red muscle fibers hanging from them. In fact, even its eyes are extremely abnormal, with black and protruding eyes, and a surface resembling a dense hexagonal insect, which makes people feel cautious at first glance. Not a human. This is definitely not a human. This is a monster dressed in human skin. Watson shouted from the bottom of his heart, since it's not human. Then it's reasonable and legal for me to kill it. The monster tilted its head, its dark eyes fixed firmly on the two humans in front of it. From its indifferent expression, it was difficult to distinguish its inner thoughts. But in the middle of the opening and closing mouthparts, the continuously swallowing, slender tongue that forked like a snake's venom, made Watson wary, as if it were a snake's probing before pouncing on it. Geo. The monster suddenly made a strange sound, which sounded like the chirping of cicadas or other insects, but it was definitely not a strange sound that human vocal cords could make. Watson couldn't understand the other person's insect language, but he sensed a hint of unease in the short and aggressive rhythm. He grabbed Miss Holmes, who was still vomiting, and helped her up with his arm, gesturing for a temporary retreat. Holmes nodded pale and walked slowly back, while cautiously raising his gun and aiming it at the monster ahead. This action immediately angered the monster, and in its remaining scattered intelligence, it still recognized the metal artifact in the opposite female upright ape's hand, which was shining with cold light and was a highly lethal weapon. Squeaky, it emitted a piercing scream like nails scraping through glass, and the two mouthparts opened outwards, suddenly lowering its body and burying its head to charge forward. This mournful scream seemed to stir up waves of surging sound, and the noise penetrated through the ear hole into the brain, shaking and echoing within the skull wall, as if surging waves were hitting reason again and again, causing Watson's brain to buzz. In a daze, he seemed to hear a strange sound of clicking in his mind, accompanied by a low, rhythmic murmur. In gi rum imus nocte et consumi. I'm so noisy, you damn it, shut up. Watson roared from the bottom of his heart, instantly breaking free from the influence of that strange sound. As soon as he woke up, he saw the monster charging in front of him, as if he could smell the foul breath of the other person within reach. Faced with this fierce attack like a fierce bull, Watson had no time to back down and dodge, but he just had difficulty with his legs and feet, and he didn't waste any effort on his hands. He picked up his cane and swung it round, facing the monster's head. A simple stick made him hit a baseball home run. The solid stick collided with the monster's head and snapped with a loud bang. Watson felt a tremendous force from Mo Pei's hand, and his tiger's mouth trembled and tingled. But the monster was only slightly tilted in the head from this blow, and its impact was not affected at all, like a wild bull about to fiercely pierce the chest of the male upright ape in front of it. He bent his left arm forward, both blocking and attacking, but felt as if his elbow had hit a hired warhorse. There was a faint but undeniable sound of bone cracking in his arms, and Watson was knocked out 2 meters by this unstoppable force until his back hit the wall next to the door, making a loud bang that shook the wall and made it tremble before stopping. Watson felt as if his internal organs were overturning the river and the sea, and the excruciating pain made him almost dizzy. His left arm drooped weakly, and strands of blood dripped down his arm to the ground. And the monster, under the anti-shock effect of this impact, was also dizzy and stunned in place, with flesh and skin splitting at the corners of its eyes, and bright red blood slowly flowing out. So the blood of this monster is also red. Watson thought so, with an ugly smile on his lips, and suddenly felt that the other person was just like that. As long as they were still injured and bleeding, it was not invincible. Holmes saw the opportunity for them to distance themselves, pulled the trigger at the right time, and with a bang, the gun barrel rotated, the firing pin struck the primer and caused an explosion. The round-headed bullet rushed impatiently out of the chamber. Her marksmanship is indeed not bad, the bullet accurately hits the target's eyebrows, blooming a faint blood flower. The monster fell backwards like a heavy hammer, crushing a low dining table without moving. Miss Holmes also breathed a sigh of relief upon seeing this, with a hint of shock on her pale face. It's Patrol John Lance. Why does he look like this ghost? Looking at him still wearing Scottish field clothes, it's likely that we're going to find John Reams. Watson came down from the wall, coughing and spitting out a mouthful of blood. He struggled to twist his cane and pulled out a narrow, dagger-like sword from inside, intending to step forward to repair the knife. But, the monster lance, who was supposed to be pierced through his brain, stood up unsteadily, with a brass bullet embedded in his forehead that failed to penetrate its frontal bone. Watson's face showed a look of horror, thinking to himself, is it okay if he gets shot in the forehead? Your skull is even harder than a bulletproof helmet. Holmes saw this shocking scene and in a fit of desperation, he pulled the trigger continuously, completely emptying the magazine. 5 blood flowers bloomed on the monster lance in a row, but it only shook its body a few times, as if it had not paid attention to these 6 bullet holes that were constantly oozing blood. It walked steadily towards the 2 of them like a copper wall and iron wall. Monster Lance's mouth slightly closed and opened, although its expression remained as stiff as a wax figure. Watson seemed to feel a hint of contempt and ridicule from it. It seems to be laughing, mocking the 2 hopeless upright apes in front of me, using up their only firearm to rely on. What other means do you have to escape from my hands? Be obedient and give up struggling and resisting, becoming my food. Integrate with the divine me. We flew all night until we were submerged in flames. End of this chapter. Is it unreasonable to carry 2 guns with you in Chapter 8? You are listening at novelfull.audio. Is it unreasonable to carry 2 guns with you in Chapter 8? Monster Lance slightly arched his body, like the strength of a fierce tiger before pouncing on it. He opened his big mouth like a knife, intending to tear the 2 upright apes in front of him into pieces and eat a hearty meal to fill his endless hunger. Let's start with the slender and tender female upright ape, which still emits a faint fragrance. Monster Lance extended his snake-like tongue to lick away the remaining flesh from his fangs and pounced fiercely at Sherlock Holmes. It pounced suddenly, moving as fast as a rabbit, so fast that Holmes couldn't even dodge in time. No matter how fast it is, it can't be faster than those 2 deafening gunshots. The monster lance's dark eyes suddenly reflected 2 rapidly approaching projectiles, and then its field of vision really became pitch black. This is the first time the monster lance has experienced such intense pain since its rebirth, as it looks up and lets out a mournful scream. But the sound fell in Watson's ear like a spring cicada chirping for a mate. He pulled the trigger with his index finger and pressed the hammer with his thumb, and slowly moved closer with his feet. His movements were fluent and handsome, as if a Western samurai on the other side of the ocean were performing an American-style residence in the sunset. Colt's muzzle spewed out fireworks one after another, and bullets with a caliber of .45 were all shot into the eyes of the monster lance. The blunt-headed bullet easily shattered the glass body, rolling continuously in the monster lance's skull, forming a large cavity, stirring the cloudy brain plasma to a mess. The nervous system was so severely damaged that the monster lance kept retreating, shaking violently all over his body, with muscle spasms and convulsions, as if he had a seizure. But even so, it still hasn't collapsed. Just stumbling like a walking corpse, with a meaningless roar in his mouth, his arms waving wildly in the air. Watson picked up a chair next to him and slammed it towards the unconscious monster lance, causing the wooden chair to shatter. He picked up a vase, a desk lamp, a low table, a small cabinet, and threw them down on the struggling monster until it fell to the ground with a loud bang, and there was no more movement. Watson was still a bit uneasy. He took a thick-edged kitchen knife from Lance's kitchen and cut several times, completely decapitating the monster Lance's head. He collapsed into the clean corner of the sofa next to him, panting heavily, and sat with the suspected body of Lance's wife. Sherlock Holmes witnessed Watson's series of atrocities and was also stunned. He never expected that the retired officer he had recruited would be so powerful that even with a broken left arm, he could still behead the monster's head. The terrifying monster lance, except for the initial sudden attack that had a slight advantage, could not hold out for 3 rounds under Watson's command, like a little white mouse in the laboratory, falling into a trap of prey, and could only passively accept the fate of being beheaded. It seems that Watson has more potential to commit a serial murder than a detective assistant. Watson saw the female detective staring at him with a strange expression on her face, thinking that the other person was questioning why he was still hiding a pistol. He spread out his hand and explained. As a weak and helpless gunman with limited mobility, it is reasonable for me to carry a second gun with me for any unforeseen circumstances. Then he noticed that the female detective glanced at Lance's head on the ground and quickly added. You see how brave he was just now. He seemed to have suffered a little skin injury after being shot several times in a row, and his vitality was really amazing. To prevent it from just falling into the guise of false death like a hibernating snake, I had to work hard to completely cut off its head. This is also logical and reasonable, right? After Watson finished speaking, he seemed to sense the nonsensical humor in his words and burst into laughter. But his mood did indeed derive pleasure from it. Killing always made him feel relaxed and comfortable, which may sound a bit abnormal, but it was also an old habit of his. Sherlock Holmes gave him a skeptical glance, which he believed, after all, Watson ultimately helped her escape the threat of the monster Lance. Although the methods used in the process were somewhat brutal. She couldn't help but feel a hint of fear as she recalled the scene just now. Holmes thought to himself, I thought after spending a month together, I already knew Watson quite well. However, beneath his gentle appearance, he still had such a cruel side hidden. Even after cutting off the monster's head, he could sit in a pool of blood and joke as if nothing had happened. When Watson chopped off Lance's head, I didn't see any emotional fluctuations on his face, only coldness and indifference in his eyes. Perhaps for him, cutting off an enemy's head was as natural as breathing. Although he has also engaged in behavior of whipping corpses that is not understood by ordinary people, it was purely for scientific research, but Watson. He is more like a professional and ruthless killing machine. She secretly glanced at Watson, who had a calm expression and was filling bullets with one hand. If it weren't for his slightly pale face and fine sweat oozing from his forehead, it was impossible to see that he had just broken his left arm in battle. Such a determined heart was truly remarkable. Is this a post-war stress disorder, or is his nature inherently so cold? Holmes hoped the answer was the former, but she couldn't help but think in the worst direction. Watson, with his disability, could play with fierce monsters between applause. If his limbs were healthy, with his extraordinary marksmanship, intelligence no less than mine, and strong willpower. Once he lost control, it would lead to great disaster. The female detective's heart was filled with complex and chaotic emotions of vigilance, caution, pity, or love, even she couldn't distinguish it herself. In short, she secretly made up her mind. I must discipline Watson well, so as not to let him go astray. She said, you take a break first, and I'll go down and have Victor notify the people at the Scottish Field. Please protect the scene. Watson tore off his shirt sleeve and wrapped it in a bandage around the wound. Don't worry, I'll watch over here, he said after Sherlock Holmes went downstairs. Watson moved his wrist slightly trembling with excessive force and looked at the sharpened kitchen knife on the ground. He thought to himself, bones are so hard, Lance, they're like steel bars. What happened to make you, an ordinary patrol officer, become such a powerful and strange creature? Watson felt a hard thump under the cushion, as if there were some hard objects hidden. He reached out and took out two thick books. The cover of one book is as bright as blood, and the cover of another book is as dim as gray. They are all genuine leather covers, with gorgeous packaging and stained with the mottled marks of time, making them expensive items at first glance. This is not something that Patrol Lance, who lives in the Audley apartments, can have, but rather quite similar to the books left at the crime scene at 3, Garden Street in Lauriston. Is it something Lance brought back from the crime scene? Watson looked at the grey book with the title written on the cover. Chen, Volume 1. This peculiar name has a similar charm to that pile of old books. Watson associated this with a corpse with an unknown cause of death and a police officer with distorted adults. The common connection between the two lies at 3 Lauriston Garden Street, and these two eccentric books further deepen this connection. Is it precisely because of these books that Lance went from an ordinary person to a worm-headed monster? Watson looked at the book in his hand, which seemed to be related to an extremely important clue. His fingers caressed the leather cover and suddenly felt an indescribable touch, cold and delicate, not like tanned leather, but rather like the surface of a cold-blooded animal, as if stroking the scales of a newly molted snake. Watson couldn't help but shudder, and the eerie feeling in his fingers disappeared without a trace, as if it had just been an illusion he had imagined in a daze. The sudden and fleeting sensation of this strange touch made Watson shudder. He immediately threw away the book in his hand and coincidentally, it was thrown next to Lance's head. In the blind spot of Watson's field of vision, Lance's ferocious head suddenly opened two dark cavities, faintly visible with the crimson radiance of soul-capturing emanating from his skull. End of this chapter. Chapter 9. See Chen. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 9. See Chen. The demonic red light emitted from Lance's skull refracted into Watson's eyes through the mirrored pool of blood condensed on the ground. His eyes flickered red in response, and a strong thirst for knowledge suddenly arose within him, like some uncontrollable physiological need. It's like being lost in a hot desert, tormented by dehydration and thirst. Every cell in his body is urging him to shout, "Book! Book! Book! Open that book!" Watson continued to resist, but his body had already succumbed to this inexplicable thirst. Spirit and flesh seemed to separate, and he trembled as he reached out to grab a book on the ground, flipping through the pages and eagerly savoring it. A crazy frenzy appeared on his face, like Lance who had just indulged in his wife's corpse. This book is actually a translated work, and it is unclear whether the translator's level is limited or intentional. The content of the book is obscure and difficult to understand, and the sentences are half-coherent, making it confusing to read. Sichengzi records a perhaps fictional mythological story, mainly telling the story of 3 extraterrestrial gods in a pitch-black forest. These 3 deities are moths, pitch-black flax, and cedars, collectively known as hours, which means controlling time or representing the laws of nature. The description of the 3 officials in the book is vague, illogical, and extremely obscure, making it pale and dull to read. But Watson, on the other hand, was mesmerized by these incomprehensible pieces of knowledge that swept through his heart, satisfying the hunger and thirst that had no source in his body. It was like drinking cool spring water in midsummer, and every pore on his body was filled with comfort. But this contentment was disturbed by a noisy scream, which kept whispering in Watson's ear, making him feel restless and uneasy. He looked up in anger, only to see the white face of the female detective filled with anxiety and worry. "Watson! Watson! Wake up!" Watson looked around in a daze. This was the home of Patrol Lance, and he was lying on the sofa with a female corpse that had been cut open. Underneath his feet was the humanoid and insect-like head that he had personally beheaded. Did I just fall asleep? Watson felt as if he had just had a strange dream, but the details of the dream were already forgotten. The female detective breathed a sigh of relief when she saw her assistant wake up safely. She said angrily, "Did you actually fall asleep? I thought you lost too much blood and became unconscious. Perhaps this gentleman has been too tired lately." At this moment, a woman with an unfamiliar face walked in from the kitchen of Lance's house. She was petite, elegant, dressed elegantly, and had fashionable fluffy short hair. Her earlobes were small ornaments like gourds, and her slender and white neck was adorned with 2 strings of pearl necklaces. Her facial features were not outstanding, but her big eyes were bright and lively, shining with wisdom and agility. Holmes introduced, "This is Dr. Natalia Long, a special investigator of the Anti-Suppression Bureau." Watson asked in confusion, "Anti-Suppression Bureau?" The Suppression Bureau is a non-public department directly under the Cabinet, responsible for handling cases that are not suitable for public disclosure, Dr. Natalia Long explained with a smile, pointing to the headless body on the floor. It's like this case and this monster. Watson asked, listen to what you mean. Isn't this kind of bizarre case rare in this world? Dr. Natalia Long is not without a direct answer. The truth involved in such cases should not have been easily revealed, and even when necessary, secret personnel from the Bureau should be dispatched to erase the memories of mortals who were accidentally contacted. But Sherlock Holmes's father, who was a famous duke with a seat in the House of Lords, was also qualified to know about these hidden knowledge. However, theoretically speaking, the other party's family should have informed her of these contents in advance. However, when I just communicated with her, I found that the other party seemed completely ignorant of the true face of the world. After pondering for a moment, Dr. Natalia Long decided to say, this should have been the knowledge sealed in the file, but since you two have been involved in the main part of this case, I will no longer conceal it. I also ask you to keep confidential what you hear next. Natalia said seriously. Human beings are not the masters of the world. In the unknown corners of history, hidden lies the true ruler of the earth. Chen. As early as when Earth was still young, even before the emergence of humans, the Chen people had already ruled this world. They are hidden beneath the surface of the world, behind the curtain of history, or directly involved, transforming into legendary deities, epic heroes, or living behind the scenes, constantly controlling human development, ruling which events become history, and which history should be woven into the future. Everything that happens in the world is nothing more than a game on a chessboard for Chen. The disputes between countries, the disasters of nature, are games that Chen enjoys tirelessly. Chen is happy to see humanity suffer, betray, deceive, fight, go crazy. For this reason, they sprinkle evil knowledge in the world. These evil taboo knowledge can drive the minds of those who see and listen insane, distorting their bodies, just like this detestable ghost. Dr. Natalia Long kicked Lance's head, but none of this can stop the pagans who pursue the power of taboos. In order to please the worshipped Chen and gain power beyond human limits, insane pagans create chaos and misfortune in the world. Dar. Natalia Long's words were resounding and powerful, like a solemn declaration under the national flag. And the purpose of our anti-suppression agency is to protect British citizens from hidden and supernatural threats, investigate, pursue, judge, and punish these inhumane pagans. Cut off the claws and teeth of the officials who extend to the world. Watson fell into contemplation upon hearing this. It seemed that the world was far more dangerous than he had imagined, and there was a deity named Chen silently controlling the entire world. However, why did the name Chen feel so familiar, as if he had heard it somewhere before? He is not a novice and has not blindly believed everything the other person said. At least the part about the responsibilities of the Anti-Suppression Bureau cannot be fully trusted. If this bureau is truly as powerful as Natalia said, then he wouldn't have encountered the insect like Lance in the first case. Watson turned his head to Sherlock Holmes and expressed his doubts with his eyes. Do you really believe what she said? Holmes nodded slightly. She had already verified Natalia's identity earlier and said, Watson, let's leave this case to Dr. Natalia. I'll take you to the hospital for treatment first. The female detective helped her limping assistant leave Audley's apartment and boarded Victor's carriage to the best royal hospital in London. After they left, Natalia retrieved 2 books with blood from under the cushion of Reams's wife's body. The title on the cover was covered with dried blood, and the pages inside were also soaked in blood. Now, the blood had coagulated, causing the pages to stick together. Even if she tried hard to tear them open, she could only see a pool of unidentified blood stains. Natalia's hanging heart finally landed. Fortunately, it's already damaged, so there's no need to worry about those 2 detectives being contaminated now. However, in the blind corner of the field of view of this Anti-Suppression Bureau investigator, Lance's head, which had fallen to the ground, suddenly experienced a ghostly phenomenon. The muscles in his cheeks began to contract, pulling the corners of his mouth upwards, as if he was laughing. In theory, the history of esoteric Buddhism is not only decided by Chen, but also by the library. However, currently, there is too little information obtained solely from insect-bird decryption. We will consider whether to introduce the setting of the 9 major libraries in the future. End of this chapter. 10. Chapter 10 Roads. Forest Land. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 10 Roads. Forest land. In the bumpy carriage, Watson leaned against the window with limping legs and crippled hands, and hurried pedestrians passed by in his eyes. Do you really believe in this so-called Anti-Suppression Bureau investigator? Dr. Natalia Long. I have checked and found out that she does have the proof presented by the House of Lords, and... Holmes paused, seemingly recalling, this is not the first time I have heard the name of the Anti-Suppression Bureau. As a child, I had eavesdropped on my elders secretly discussing the matter of the Bureau. Watson couldn't help but glance and thought to himself, I didn't expect Charlotte to be so rebellious when she was a child. So what she said about Chen? Have you heard of it before? That's not true. Holmes shook his head. Today is the first time in my life that I have come into contact with these strange and cognitive subversion things. The female detective finished speaking and leaned back in the chair dejectedly, with furrowed brows and empty eyes, lost in thought. Watson speculated that the female detective should be confused. Why the elder who knew about the existence of the Anti-Suppression Bureau had never revealed the truth of this world to herself. The carriage arrived at the Royal Liberty Hospital in silence. The Royal Free Hospital is a teaching hospital of the University of London School of Medicine, formerly known as the London Free General Hospital, aimed at providing free medical services to the poor who cannot afford illness. Later, the hospital received a large number of patients during a cholera epidemic that swept through London. The Queen felt her eagerness for public welfare and granted her a royal charter, granting her a special status. From then on, the Free General Hospital was officially renamed as the Royal Free Hospital. The name of the royal family is so prestigious that after the founder's death, the service recipients of the hospital also began to climb with this prestigious name, jumping to the aristocratic merchant class closer to the word royal. As for those poor and filthy lower-class people, they are mercilessly abandoned. On weekdays, with Watson's meager pension, it was determined that he would not come here for medical treatment. However, this time he was also injured on duty, with the support of Sherlock Holmes from a wealthy family, and he also had acquaintances in this hospital. As soon as they entered the emergency room, they ran into Lillian Stanford Jr., who had worked as a military doctor and had excellent trauma management skills. Under the operation of the Stanford family, he had already served as an attending physician in the emergency department. Watson, Sherlock Holmes, why are you here? As soon as little Stanford saw 2 familiar faces and was happy, he saw Watson's left arm drooping and exclaimed in surprise, Watson, are you injured? Why is it so dangerous to change careers and become a detective? Little Stanford quickly called for the nurse below to come over. Watson waved his hand and declined the kind assistance of the blonde wave nurse. It's just a little skin injury, don't you understand me? This injury doesn't even need to be dealt with on the battlefield in Fulstein. He said. This sentence woke up little Stanford. It was because of his recent interactions with Watson that he always had the impression of being polite. He almost forgot that this friend was a hero who had experienced countless battles, and a bone fracture was just that. Little Stanford nodded and said, that's true. Such a minor injury is really not worth mentioning to Watson. I have diagnosed everything for you. There is a fracture of the proximal ulna in the left arm, with slight vascular damage. Just wrap it up for me and tie it with a fixed splint. I really have to thank you for saving me a lot of effort, little Stanford laughed, but then the conversation changed. However, as your attending physician, I still need to confirm the specific situation. He rolled up Watson's sleeve and gently squeezed the swollen area with his upper hand, only to find that the injury was not as light as Watson had said. Hiss. You're too modest, it's not just a skin injury. Little Stanford frowned slightly and lowered his head to write and draw in his medical record book, saying, "I must rest and recuperate well in the near future. Should I just stay here for a few days?" "No need to. Stay." Watson was about to refuse when Holmes behind him had already taken the lead in answering. The female detective blinked cunningly and said, "Watson, take this time to rest well. If you don't take good care of yourself, how can you continue with the investigation?" Watson immediately understood, and it seemed that Charlotte did not intend to give up the case on this matter. It was exactly what I wanted. He was also unwilling to let his first case of detective career slip through his fingers. He had not yet tasted the sense of achievement that could solve the mystery. Then hospitalized. It was already evening after all the busy work was completed, and under the dual influence of money and network, Watson was arranged to stay in a separate single-patient room. This place is spacious, quiet and elegant, clean and tidy. Everything is quite good, but the room is really plain. The ceiling is pure white, the walls are pure white, the floor is pure white, and even the bed is pure white. The color is so faint that Watson recalls his early experiences of being confined. At first, the female detective and little Stanford were still accompanying one or two nearby, but as the sky grew darker, both of them had already left. Watson was the only one left in the large room of the hospital, lying bored in bed with his left arm in plaster. What he saw and heard in the daytime flashed through his mind like a lantern, with bodies of unknown causes of death, distorted insects and monsters, mysterious anti-suppression measures, and incredible sicken. Watson's thinking tried hard to open the doors of these hidden worlds to him, enough to glimpse the scales and claws of that magnificent world from the crack in the door. But where should Watson go? This time, being able to defeat the insect monster Lance relied entirely on the opponent's carelessness and brainlessness. If there were two more, even if there were firearms to succeed, it would be difficult to match. If my legs and feet are still healthy. Watson glanced at his struggling left leg and sighed regretfully. He understood that the upcoming case investigation would likely become even more dangerous. In addition to mental battles, there would also be physical struggles, which could be both dangerous and exciting. Watson was not afraid of challenges, only afraid of ordinary and unknown death, but he began to worry again. With his current physical condition, whether he could cope with these challenges was not because he was afraid of failure, but because he was afraid it would drag down Holmes and become a useless burden. Time flies by in my wild thoughts, the night is already deep, and the hospital is eerily quiet. Watson looked at the dancing tree shadows gradually emerging from the window, listening to the whispering sound of flying insects flapping their wings among the branches. His mind suddenly came to him, as if he had broken through some kind of limitation. Just like a frightened little beast crying and running back to its nest, Watson began to recall the lost memories of the day. The ghostly figure hidden in the kerosene lamp, and the mysterious and thirsty Chen scroll that triggered his inner hunger. In an instant, his bones and hair stood on end. It turned out that he had already been exposed to these strange things before he knew it. But why did he not even leave a trace of it at that time, and only then did he suddenly wake up? Watson's heart was filled with confusion, which made him feel restless, like a restless mole pulling at his brain. To the extent that it really made him unearth something unusual in his skull. The divine joy of the forest lies in separating strands of hair from the scalp. If seeking attention, burn it. If seeking opportunity, bury it. If you cut a strand of hair before bedtime to pay tribute to the god of the forest, you may be able to embark on a straight path. This strange text suddenly appeared in Watson's mind, without knowing its origin or source, but he was deeply fascinated by it. His body suddenly lost control and pulled a strand of hair from the back of his head, causing him to feel a burst of pain and excitement as if the restlessness was really pulling away with the thread of worry. This self-destructive behavior seemed to coincide with some eerie and mysterious ritual. Watson suddenly felt his eyelids heavy like lead, and his drowsiness engulfed him like surging waves. His consciousness quickly sank into a dream. In his dream, he was still in a pure white and colorless hospital room, lying on a bed filled with the smell of disinfectant, but in his arms he held the cold and lifeless book of Sichinji. Although it was a dream, Watson's thinking was unprecedentedly clear. With lingering fear, he looked at the book in his hand. In theory, dreams were a manifestation of the subconscious, but this was just the result of his own imagination. But Watson couldn't help but tremble uncontrollably. The strange loss of control just now made him feel immense fear, and he watched Sichinji with vigilance. Even in his dreams, Watson could feel the icy and piercing touch of the leather cover, as if the book was not his imagination, but a real object. Is it possible that this book is the taboo knowledge mentioned by Natalia, an investigator of the Anti-Suppression Bureau? He suddenly became curious about what kind of knowledge could make an ordinary patrol officer mutate into a powerful monster capable of withstanding firearms. If this power can be used by me. Watson's eyes seemed to ignite a raging flame, with heterogeneous hunger and thirst roaring in his heart. It was a suppressed ambition for a long time. At first, when he traveled across the country, he also had a lofty aspiration, believing that a man born in a chaotic world should make immortal achievements. Since heaven has given him a chance to do it again, let's make a great achievement. However, the confidence of the interloper could not withstand the brutality of war. The painful lesson of being shot and dismounted in Fulstein made Watson understand that he was not the son of fate in the novel. A brass bullet worth less than 10 pence could easily take his life. Pain undermines fighting spirit, weakness extinguishes wild hope. But today's experience reignited Watson's strong ambition, and he realized that he might have already mastered the key to another world. He yearns for power, surpassing the power of collective society. He yearns for knowledge, knowing the wisdom of the past and future. He craves stimulation and feels the joy that no one else can experience. And more efficient killing methods. The taboo power that transcends human limits. I am determined to win. The long-suppressed ambition suddenly reignited, and Watson resolutely opened the pages of Sichinji, only to see dazzling brilliance bursting between the lines. These stars shine like clusters of fireflies flying forward like the Milky Way, condensing into a bright silver staircase that rises into a gray neon, leading to a window that appears at an unknown time. Outside the window is a dark and quiet forest, with low branches drooping green and poisonous fruits. The tree is covered with pitch-black moss, and its thick and twisted roots rise and fall like leaping pythons. Its color is as bright as flesh-red pulp. Amidst the moss, the ancient tree body presents a thick, ink-like color, covered with dried bark like scales. As you stroke it with your fingers, you can feel the coldness of steel and the pulsation of breath. Wait. Watson woke up with a terrifying shock and suddenly looked up. On top of it was a dense and towering tree, and an incomplete moon could be vaguely seen. The cold moonlight was as white as blood droplets, watering out the traces of swaying tree shadows. It was right on his face, as if he could feel the gentle caress of the moonlight passing by. He was shocked and pale. When did he enter this deep forest? Watson uses the moth to dream and gains the path. Forest, end of this chapter.